Security, get this delusional girl out of here. Coleman's voice, pure, uncut venom. Funny, because until then, I was just Maya Jenkins' waitress. Now, I'm a goddamn problem. See, I just told him that his trillion-dollar tech, stolen. From my dead dad. Except, here's the kicker. He flinched, like he'd seen a ghost. Dramatic, right? But here's what Coleman doesn't know. What none of them know. My dad wasn't the type to give up, and neither am I. He thinks I'm some hysterical nobody. He's so wrong. Kindness runs deep in my veins, but so does something else. A quiet fire that's about to burn everything he built to the ground. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. As she refilled his water, he slid a worn leather-bound portfolio across the mahogany table to his investors, revealing the schematic that started it all. And in that moment, Maya's world stopped. Because in the bottom right corner, in a familiar, elegant cursive, was a signature she hadn't seen in 10 years. The signature of a ghost. The Gilded Compass wasn't just a restaurant. It was a theater. Every night, the city's most powerful players performed their ritual of dominance and celebration on its dimly lit stage. Maya Jenkins was part of the invisible crew, a ghost in a crisp black uniform, trained to be present but unseen, to anticipate a need before it was spoken. Her movements were economical, honed by 2 years of balancing trays heavy with Chateauneuf dupe and plates of meticulously arranged truffle rotto. Tonight, her section was graced by Arthur Coleman. He wasn't just wealthy, he was a force of nature. A man who had single-handedly revolutionized the energy sector with his company Coleman Industries and its proprietary Coleman core technology. He had the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having been told no, and meaning it. His voice cut through the restaurant's polite hum, sharp and decisive, as he ordered for the entire table of 3 sycophantic investors. We'll start with the oysters Rockefeller and bring a bottle of the O for 5 Moach, the real one. Not the cellar backup, he'd commanded, not looking at Maya, but at a point somewhere over her shoulder. Maya simply nodded, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Of course, sir. Inside a familiar, bitter cocktail of resentment and fatigue churned. She should have been designing quantum processes right now, not serving them. 2 years ago, she'd been a top student at Caltech on a full scholarship. Her future, a brilliant ascending trajectory. Then the phone call came. Her mother, Helen, had collapsed. A rare degenerative neurological disorder. The scholarship covered tuition, not the mountain of medical bills and the cost of round-the-clock care. So Maya had dropped out, trading a world of theoretical physics for the tangible reality of rent payments and prescription costs. She moved back home, took the best-paying job she could find without a degree, and watched her dreams recede in the rearview mirror. Her life was now a loop, the pre-dawn quiet of her small apartment, checking on her sleeping mother, the long bus ride to the restaurant, the exhausting dance of service, the late-night ride home, and the quiet hours studying her father's old textbooks, trying to keep the fire in her mind from flickering out. Her father, Robert Jenkins, the gaping hole in her life. He was a brilliant physicist, a man who saw the universe in patterns and equations. He used to fill napkins with designs for perpetual motion machines and explain stellar nucleosynthesis to her as a bedtime story. 10 years ago, when she was 12, he had simply vanished. One day he was there excitedly telling her he was on the verge of a breakthrough, a new way to harness plasma energy that would change everything. The next he was gone. The police found his car abandoned near the cliffs by the old lighthouse. A note was found, but it was vague, speaking of failure and pressure. They ruled it a suicide, body never recovered. The loss had shattered their family. It broke her mother's spirit long before the illness broke her body. It left Maya with a knowing sense of wrongness, a deep-seated refusal to believe the official story. Her father was a fighter, a man whose optimism was as boundless as the cosmos he studied. He wouldn't have just given up. Waitress? Coleman's voice snapped her back to the present. He gestured impatiently at his empty water glass. My apologies, sir. Maya moved forward with the picture, her hands steady, despite the tremor of irritation inside her. As she leaned in to pour Coleman in, a moment of theatrical pride opened the worn leather portfolio he'd brought with him. Gentlemen, he announced to his guests, his voice booming with self-satisfaction. Before we talk about the future, let me show you the past. The very genesis of Coleman Industries. The napkin sketch, so to speak. He slid a single laminated page from the portfolio. It wasn't a napkin, but a sheet of drafting paper yellowed with age, covered in complex equations, and a beautifully intricate schematic. It depicted a toroidal chamber interwoven with magnetic field lines and particle injectors. It was a fusion energy device, elegant and revolutionary. Maya's breath caught in her throat. It was hauntingly familiar, like a melody from a half-forgotten dream. She'd seen drawings like this her entire childhood scattered across her father's desk. Coleman tapped a finger on the page. 20 years ago, a flash of inspiration that became a trillion-dollar reality. The original design for the Coleman core. His guests murmured in awe, but Maya wasn't looking at them. Her eyes were fixed on the bottom right-hand corner of the page. There, beside a date from 2 decades ago, was a signature, a fluid, confident script. The R, a grand looping flourish. The J, a sharp, decisive downstroke. Time slowed. The clatter of the restaurant faded into a distant roar. The weight of the water pitcher in her hand became immense. It was a signature she had traced with her finger 1,000 times on birthday cards, on permission slips, on the title pages of her favorite books. It was the signature of the man who taught her the names of the constellations. Robert Jenkins. The world tilted on its axis. Every doubt, every suspicion she had harbored for a decade coalesced into a single blinding point of certainty. A cold fury, sharp and pure, sliced through her exhaustion. Her voice, when it came out, was not the differential whisper of a waitress. It was quiet, clear, and carried the weight of 10 years of grief. "Sir," she said, her eyes locked on his. "That's my dad's signature." Arthur Coleman froze. For a split second, his face was a canvas of raw, unguarded emotion. It wasn't just surprise. It was the primal shock of a ghost stepping out of a grave. The deer in the headlights terror of a man whose carefully constructed reality was cracking beneath his feet. The smug, condescending mask he wore for the world dissolved, revealing something ugly and frightened underneath. The crystal water glass halfway to his lips slipped from his grasp. It seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before it struck the edge of the mahogany table. The sound wasn't a tinkling break, but a sharp, violent explosion. Shards of glass sprayed across the polished wood and the pristine white tablecloth. Water pulled around the base of the broken stem, seeping into the corner of the precious schematic. "What? What did you just say?" Coleman stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. His eyes, wide and panicked, darted from mirror to the signature on the page, then back again. The 3 investors stared, bewildered, their forks hovering midair. The sudden violence of the dropped glass had shattered the restaurant's placid atmosphere. Heads were turning at nearby tables. Mr. Dubois, the restaurant's impeccably dressed and perpetually anxious manager, was already gliding towards them, his face a mask of polite concern. Mir didn't flinch. The cold certainty that had taken root in her chest held her steady. She pointed a trembling but determined finger at the page. "That signature, Jenkins. That's Robert Jenkins. He was my father." Coleman's shock was rapidly being replaced by a frantic, cornered animal fury. He snatched the schematic away from the spreading puddle of water, frantically dabbing at it with a linen napkin. "That's preposterous," he boomed, his voice regaining its force, but now edged with a brittle, defensive anger. "Security. Get this delusional girl out of here." "I'm not delusional," Maya said, her voice rising to match his, cutting through the murmurs of the other patrons. "I know his signature. I know his work. Those are his equations. He called his design project Chimera. He told me about it." The name hit Coleman like a physical blow. His face went pale, a sickly, chalky white beneath his expensive tan. Project Chimera. It was a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 20 years, a name buried deep in the foundations of his empire, a ghost he thought he had exorcised forever. Mr. Dubois arrived at the table, his smile stretched painfully thin. "Mr. Coleman, is there a problem, ma'am?" "Please, you're disturbing our guests. This waitress is harassing me and my guests with outlandish fantasies. Coleman snarled, shoving the schematic back into his portfolio and snapping it shut. He stood up, towering over Maya, using his physical presence to intimidate her. She's clearly unstable. I want her fired now, sir. I can assure you. Dubois began turning to Maya with pleading eyes. But Maya wouldn't be silenced. 10 years of unanswered questions of a grief she was told to accept, without proof, were boiling over. He's lying, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. She looked past Coleman at the stunned faces of his investors. That technology, the Coleman core, it was my father's. He disappeared 10 years ago. This man built his fortune on a stolen idea and a lie. One of the investors, a silver-haired man named Peterson, looked at Coleman, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The CEO's reaction was too extreme, too violent for a simple misunderstanding. It was the reaction of a man with something to hide. That's enough, Coleman roared. He grabbed Maya's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. Get out! Get out of my sight! Maya wrenched her arm away, stumbling back. You can't just make people disappear. Mr. Coleman, the truth doesn't work that way, Mr. Dubois. Seeing a billion-dollar client on the verge of a public meltdown made his choice. He stepped between them, his body shielding Coleman. Miss Jenkins, that's enough. You're fired. Please collect your things and leave the premises immediately. Security will escort you out. Two burly security guards who had been hovering nearby moved in. They didn't touch her, but their presence was a solid wall. The fight drained out of Maya, replaced by a profound, chilling sense of injustice. She had spoken the truth, a truth that had been simmering inside her for a decade. And in response, the world had closed ranks to protect the powerful man and cast her out. She looked at Arthur Coleman one last time. The fear was gone from his face, replaced by a cold, reptilian mask of controlled fury. His eyes held a silent, brutal promise. This is not over. I will destroy you for this. As the guards walked her toward the staff exit, a path of silence parting before them, she could hear Coleman's voice, artificially smooth now, trying to salvage the evening. My deepest apologies, gentlemen, a disgruntled employee, utterly mad. Now about those expansion projections. The heavy kitchen door swung shut behind her, cutting off the sound. Maya stood in the clattering, steam-filled chaos of the kitchen, her apron feeling like a costume she no longer had a right to wear. She had been fired. She was jobless. Her mother's next round of medication was due in a week. But amidst the panic and the humiliation, a new feeling was taking root. It was a cold, hard resolve. Coleman's reaction hadn't been one of innocence. It had been one of guilt. He wasn't just a thief. He was hiding something much, much darker. He hadn't just stolen her father's work. He knew what happened to him. Maya Jenkins, the poor waitress, was gone. In her place stood the daughter of Robert Jenkins, and she had just found her life's new mission to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Her father hadn't just vanished. He had been erased, and she was going to write him back into existence. The termination was swift and brutal. Mr. Dubois handed her a small box containing her locker contents and her final paycheck. His face a stony mask of disapproval. He made it clear that she would receive no severance, no reference, and that if she ever set foot on the property again, she would be arrested for trespassing. The message was clear. Arthur Coleman's influence extended far beyond the walls of his corporation. The bus ride home was a blur of streetlights and shame. The weight of her new reality pressed down on her. No job, a sick mother, a powerful enemy. It was an impossible situation. When she finally crept into her small apartment, the only sound was the gentle, rhythmic breathing of her mother sleeping in the next room. The sight of Helen, so frail and vulnerable, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. What had she done? She had traded their fragile stability for a moment of righteous anger. She sank onto the worn sofa, her head in her hands. The scene in the restaurant replayed in her mind. The shock on Coleman's face, the venom in his eyes, the name Project Chimera. It wasn't a fantasy, it was real. A new thought cut through the despair. For 10 years, she had only had grief and suspicion. Now she had a name, Arthur Coleman, and she had a target. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline that pushed back her exhaustion, Maya went to the hall closet and pulled the string for the attic stairs. The rickety wooden steps groaned in protest as she ascended into the cold, dusty space. The attic was a mausoleum of their former life, filled with boxes of things Helen couldn't bear to part with after Robert disappeared. It smelled of old paper cedar and forgotten memories. Under a single bare light bulb, she began her search. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. A clue, a connection, anything. She sifted through boxes of old holiday decorations, her childhood report cards, and stacks of photographs. And then she found it, a heavy-duty cardboard box labeled simply RJ Work. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She sliced through the brittle packing tape with a utility knife and lifted the flap. Inside were dozens of notebooks, the spiral-bound kind you buy at a university bookstore. They were filled with her father's dense, intricate handwriting, page after page of equations, theories, and diagrams. It was his life's work. She spent the next few hours on the dusty floor, a lone archaeologist unearthing a lost civilization. She found early drafts of the schematic she had seen tonight with notes in the margins. One read, "A thinks the containment field is too unstable. I know I can solve it. A.C. Arthur Coleman." Deeper in the box, she found a manila folder. Inside were not schematics, but photographs. Her breath hitched. There was her father, 20 years younger, grinning, his arms slung around a much younger, thinner Arthur Coleman. They were standing outside a drab building, a sign behind them reading Northwood Applied Sciences. They looked like friends, partners. Coleman wasn't just a corporate shark who had stumbled upon her father's work. They had known each other. They had worked together. This betrayal was deeper, more personal than she could have imagined. She kept digging. At the very bottom of the box, tucked into a sleeve at the back of a thick binder, was a single sheet of paper. It was a carbon copy of a legal document, a partnership dissolution agreement between Robert Jenkins and Arthur Coleman for a company called Helios Innovations. It was dated just 3 weeks before her father disappeared. According to the dense legal text, Robert Jenkins was relinquishing all claims to their shared intellectual property, specifically something referred to as Project Chimera, in exchange for a paltry sum. The document stated that the dissolution was due to Mr. Jenkins's increasingly erratic behavior and professional misconduct. The most chilling part was the signature at the bottom. It was her father's name, but the signature was wrong. It was a crude, clumsy forgery. The elegant looping R was cramped. The sharp J was hesitant and shaky. It looked nothing like the confident signature on the schematic Coleman had shown off, and nothing like the thousands of examples she had in the notebooks around her. This was it, the smoking gun. Coleman hadn't just stolen the idea. He had fabricated a legal document to cover his tracks. He had engineered a coup painting her father as unstable to discredit him and seize control of their life's work. A cold dread washed over her. The story of her father's suicide suddenly seemed much more sinister. A man about to be robbed of his entire legacy, his reputation destroyed by his partner. Would he fall into despair and walk into the sea? Or would he fight back? And what would a ruthless man like Arthur Coleman do to someone who stood in the way of a trillion-dollar idea? The thought was so terrifying she felt physically ill. He hadn't just erased her father's name from a patent. He had erased her father. Maya carefully gathered the forged document, the photograph, and one of the notebooks containing the earliest Project Chimera designs. The dust of the attic no longer felt like the dust of the dead. It felt like gunpowder. She had been a victim for 10 years, adrift in a sea of grief. Now she had evidence. She had a direction, and she had an enemy. Descending from the attic as the first gray light of dawn broke through the living room window, Maya felt a profound shift within herself. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. She was no longer just fighting for the memory of her father. She was fighting for his life. She had to prove he didn't sign that paper, that he didn't kill himself. She had to find out what really happened 10 years ago, and she knew she couldn't do it alone. Maya knew her next step couldn't be the police, a forged document from 10 years ago, and the word of a fired waitress against a beloved billionaire. They would dismiss her before she even finished her story. She needed someone who already knew how to fight giants, someone who wasn't afraid of Arthur Coleman. She spent the day at the public library using their computers to dig into Coleman's past. She searched for articles, lawsuits, and any hint of controversy connected to him or Coleman Industries. For a man of his stature, his public record was suspiciously clean. But as she dug deeper into archived news sites from 5 or 6 years ago, she found a name: Ben Carter. Ben Carter had been an investigative journalist for the New York Chronicle, a rising star known for his tenacious and unflinching exposés on corporate malfeasance. And 6 years ago, he had set his sights on Arthur Coleman. He published a series of articles hinting at irregularities in the founding of Coleman Industries, questioning the timeline of the Coleman cause development and citing anonymous sources who spoke of a shadow partner who had been forced out. The blowback had been immediate and catastrophic. Coleman Industries sued Carter and the Chronicle for defamation, launching a ruthless smear campaign that painted Carter as a reckless fabulist. His anonymous sources recanted, likely under duress or with a hefty payout. The Chronicle, facing a legal battle that could bankrupt them, buckled. They settled out of court, fired Ben Carter, and issued a full retraction of his articles. Carter was professionally ruined. He had been untouchable. And then he was a pariah. Mir found his current whereabouts through a fringe tech blog he now ran from his apartment. It was a shadow of his former work, a cynical, rambling platform where he railed against the tech giants who had cast him out. He was a wounded lion, still roaring, but from the confines of a cage. He was perfect. She found his address in a gritty industrial part of the city. His apartment building was a walk-up with peeling paint and the lingering smell of damp concrete. She knocked on the door of apartment 4B, her heart pounding. The man who answered was not what she expected. He was younger than his photo suggested, maybe in his late 30s, with tired eyes that held a spark of weary intelligence. His hair was unkempt. He needed a shave, and his t-shirt was stained with what looked like coffee. "Yeah," he asked, his voice growly. "Are you Ben Carter?" He leaned against the doorframe, his expression a mixture of suspicion and boredom. "Depends who's asking. If you're selling something, I'm not buying. If you're serving papers, just leave them on the mat." "My name is Maya Jenkins," she said, holding her tote bag tighter. "I read your articles about Arthur Coleman." His eyes narrowed. The boredom vanished, replaced by a flash of something sharp and painful. "Ancient history. I was wrong. The paper said so. The whole world said so. Now, if you'll excuse me." He started to close the door. "Wait." Maya put her hand out, stopping the door. "You weren't wrong. You were right. You just didn't have the proof." He paused, studying her face. He saw not a fanatic or a crank, but a young woman with a desperate seriousness in her eyes. He sighed a sound of profound weariness and opened the door wider. "You've got 5 minutes. Then I'm kicking you out." His apartment was a chaotic mess of books, stacked newspapers, and whiteboards covered in diagrams and scribbled notes, all connected with a web of red string. It was the lair of a man obsessed. In the center of it all was a massive board dedicated to Coleman Industries. "You're still investigating him?" Maya said, a statement, not a question. "Let's call it a hobby," Ben muttered, clearing a pile of magazines off a chair. "Like building ships in a bottle. Pointless, but it passes the time." "So what's your story? Did Coleman's new factory pollute your drinking water? Did his self-driving car run over your cat?" Maya ignored his cynicism. She walked to his Coleman-centric whiteboard and took out the items from her bag. First, she pinned up the photograph of her father and a young Arthur Coleman. Ben's eyes widened slightly. "Who's the other guy?" "My father." "Robert Jenkins," Maya said. Then she pinned the forged partnership dissolution agreement next to the photo. "And this is the document Coleman used to steal his work. Look at the signature." Ben leaned in, his journalistic instincts kicking in despite himself. He peered at the crude signature, then looked at Mia, and last night Mia continued, her voice steady. "Arthur Coleman was at the restaurant where I work. He was showing off the original schematic for the Coleman core. It had my father's real signature on it. I called him out on it. He had me fired." Ben was silent for a long moment. He walked around the small apartment, rubbing the back of his neck. He picked up the photo, studying the faces of the two young men, so full of hope and ambition. He looked at the forged document, his trained eye, seeing the tells of a fake, the inconsistent pressure, the hesitation in the strokes. He looked at the young woman standing in his living room, who had just risked everything to confront a titan. Project Chimera, he said softly, looking at his own whiteboard where he had scrolled the name with a question mark next to it, a tidbit from one of the sources who had later recanted. Your father's name for it. Yes, Maya whispered. Ben finally looked at her, and for the first time the cynicism in his eyes was gone, replaced by the ghost of the crusading reporter he used to be. The fire wasn't out. It had just been banked, waiting for fuel. Kid, he said, his voice rough with emotion, do you have any idea what you've stumbled into? This isn't just about stolen credit. A man like Coleman doesn't build $1 trillion empire and leave loose ends if your father didn't sign that paper, and then he conveniently disappears. I know, Maya said, her voice trembling slightly. I think he's alive. I think Coleman hid him somewhere. I don't believe he's dead. Ben stared at her, then at his board, at the web of lies and power he had been trying to untangle for 6 years. He had been missing the key, the human element, the victim, the proof. And now she was standing in his apartment. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a chance at redemption, his own, and Robert Jenkins. Okay, Maya Jenkins, he said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. You've got my attention. Let's go hunting. The alliance between Maya and Ben was forged in the crucible of shared purpose. Ben's apartment became their war room. His chaotic energy, once aimless, now had a laser focus. He resurrected old contacts, dusted off interviewing techniques, and pored over the evidence Mia had brought with a hunger he hadn't felt in years. Maya in turn provided the crucial context, poring over her father's notebooks, deciphering his scientific shorthand, and painting a picture of the brilliant, trusting man Arthur Coleman had betrayed. Their first lead was Northwood Applied Sciences, the company in the photograph. A few calls revealed it had been a small tech incubator that went bankrupt over 15 years ago. Most of its records were lost, but Ben's persistence paid off. He tracked down a name from an old staff directory, Walter Schmidt, a senior lab technician who had worked with both Jenkins and Coleman. Finding him wasn't easy. Walter Schmidt had fallen off the grid. There was no social media presence, no current address. Ben finally found him through a membership list for a vintage radio enthusiast club. He was living in a quiet retirement community 3 hours out of the city. When they arrived at his small, immaculately kept bungalow, Walter was a nervous bird-like man in his late 70s with watery blue eyes. He was hesitant to even let them in, but the moment Mayer introduced herself as Robert Jenkins' daughter, his composure crumbled. He ushered them inside, his hands trembling. I knew this day would come, he whispered, wringing his hands. I always knew it. Sitting in his sun-drenched living room, surrounded by old ham radios, Walter Schmidt unburdened his conscience of a 20-year wait. Robert, he was a genius. Walter began, his voice thick with emotion. The rest of us were just chemists and engineers. He was a poet of physics. Arthur, on the other hand, was the salesman. He was charming, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. He saw the genius in Robert, but he saw it as a product, a resource to be exploited. He told them about Project Chimera. He confirmed it was Robert's brainchild from start to finish. Coleman's contribution was securing funding and managing the business side. As Robert got closer to a stable working prototype, Coleman grew more possessive and secretive. Arthur started locking Robert out of the business meetings. Walter explained he'd tell the investors it was his work, that Robert was just a brilliant but unstable researcher who needed management. He was laying the groundwork for the betrayal. The day it happened was seared into Walter's memory. Coleman called an emergency meeting with the small staff. He held up a signed document, the same one Mir had found, and announced that Robert Jenkins was leaving the company due to a nervous breakdown. It was a lie, Walter said, his voice cracking. Robert was stressed, yes, but he was on the cusp of a breakthrough. He wasn't unstable. He was excited. Later that day, I saw two men who didn't look like scientists or investors, escorting a protesting Robert out of the lab. Arthur told us he was being taken to get help. We never saw him again. Maya felt the air leave her lungs. You saw them take him? Walter nodded, shamefaced. We were all scared. Arthur had just secured a new round of funding based on Robert's latest data. He told us that if word got out about Robert's instability, the funding would vanish and we'd all be out of a job. He made us complicit in our silence. He paid us all a hefty severance when he dissolved Helios Innovations and started Coleman Industries a month later. It was hush money. Ben leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Walter, you said they were taking him to get help. Do you know where? A hospital. A clinic. Walter hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if Coleman himself might be listening. Arthur was talking on the phone earlier that day. I wasn't supposed to hear. He mentioned a place, a long-term care facility. He said it was private discreet, a place where difficult cases could be managed indefinitely away from prying eyes. Willow Creek. He mentioned a place called Willow Creek Sanitarium. The name hung in the air heavy and ominous. A sanitarium, not a hospital, a place for the forgotten. Is it still around? Maya asked, her voice a strange whisper. Ben was already typing furiously on his laptop. After a few minutes of searching, his face grew grim. It is rebranded now as Willow Creek Wellness Retreat. It's a high-end, high-security private facility in the middle of nowhere. It specializes in long-term psychiatric care for high-net-worth individuals. The board of directors is anonymous, managed through a series of shell corporations, but I'd bet my life savings that Arthur Coleman is pulling the strings. Maya stood up, a storm of emotions raging inside her. Grief, fury, and a terrifying fragile flicker of hope. Her father wasn't dead. He was a prisoner. For 10 years he had been locked away, silenced, while his captor built an Emma on his stolen dreams. We have to get him out, she said, her voice shaking with a newfound iron-willed resolve. Walter looked at her, his watery eyes filled with a sad admiration. Be careful, child. Arthur Coleman is not the same ambitious young man I knew. He's a monster now, and he has spent 20 years protecting his great lie. He will do anything, anything to keep it buried. The revelation that her father was likely alive, a prisoner in a gilded cage, changed the entire dynamic of their investigation. It was no longer a quest for justice. It was a rescue mission. The stakes had been raised from reputation to life and liberty. Ben Carter used his investigative skills to dig into Willow Creek Wellness Retreat. What he found was a fortress. It was nestled in a remote wooded valley surrounded by state-of-the-art security pressure plates, Surrey infrared cameras, and a private security force with military-grade training. Getting in through the front gate was impossible without a court order, which they couldn't get without concrete proof that Robert was inside. And they couldn't get that proof without getting in. It was a perfect catch-22 designed by a man who left nothing to chance. As they brainstormed in Ben's apartment, the pressure from Coleman began to mount. It started subtly. Mears' application for unemployment was inexplicably denied due to a clerical error. Then Ben's blog was hit with a series of sophisticated cyber attacks, repeatedly crashing the site. They were being watched. The intimidation escalated one evening when Maya returned home. The lock on her apartment door was busted. The wood splintered inside. The place had been tossed. It wasn't a robbery. Her small TV and her mother's jewelry were untouched, but her father's boxes from the attic were rifled through notebooks scattered across the floor. The message was clear. We know who you are. We know what you're looking for. Stop. Maya's mother, Helen, was terrified. Maya, please, she pleaded, her voice frail. Whatever this is, it's not worth it. Coleman is too powerful. I can't lose you too. Looking at her mother's frightened face, Mia felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly consumed by a defiant rage. This is why we have to do it, Mom, she said, her voice low and fierce. They're not just protecting a lie anymore. They're scared. We're getting close. The break-ins solidified their resolve. They had to act, and they had to act fast. Their only hope was Walter Schmidt. They called him, explaining the situation. The old technician, racked with guilt and horrified by the intimidation tactics, finally agreed to help them in a more direct way. There might be a way in, Walter said, over a secure line Ben had set up. The facility's older wing, the original sanitarium, has an outdated HVAC system. I know this because Helios Innovations bid on a contract to upgrade it years ago, well before everything. The plans should still be in the county archives. It's a long shot, but there might be an unguarded service duct, a blind spot in the security. It was the sliver of hope they needed. Ben, using a fake ID and a plausible cover story about historical preservation, managed to access the county's archived blueprints. He spent a day poring over the decades-old schematics, and he found it. A large ventilation outflow duct on the west side of the building, concealed by a thicket of overgrown woods. According to the plans, it was big enough for a person to crawl through and led directly to the basement service tunnels of the older long-term residential wing. It was a blind spot, too old and seemingly insignificant to be covered by the new high-tech security grid. Their plan was desperate and dangerous. Ben would act as lookout and communications hub from a rental car parked a mile down the road. Mayor, being smaller and more agile, would be the one to go inside. Walter had given them the layout of the residential wing from memory, including the likely location of the discreet high-security rooms used for patients like her father. She would have a small earpiece to communicate with Ben and a modified cell phone to photograph any evidence she found. The night they chose was dark and moonless, with a forecast of rain to help cover any noise. As they drove towards the remote facility, the silence in the car was thick with tension. Ben glanced over at Ma. She was dressed in dark clothing, her face pale but set with determination. She looked impossibly young to be taking on such a monumental risk. "You don't have to do this, Maya," he said softly. "We can find another way." "What other way is there, Ben?" she replied, her gaze fixed on the dark road ahead. "He's been in there for 10 years. Every day we wait is another day he loses." "I'm going in." They parked on a dirt logging trail hidden from the main road. Ben set up his surveillance equipment, a laptop linked to a signal booster and a police scanner. "Okay," he said, his voice. "All business comms check." "I hear you," Maya whispered into the tiny microphone on her collar. "You have a 30-minute window max. After that, the night shift security patrol does a perimeter sweep. Get in, find him, get a picture, and get out. Do not engage. Do not get caught. Your safety is the priority." Maya nodded her heart, feeling like a drum against her ribs. She pulled a small backpack on containing a flashlight, a multi-tool, and the burner phone. They synchronized their watches. "Good luck," Maya Ben said, his eyes filled with a concern that went beyond the story. She gave him a small, tight smile. "See you in 30 minutes. Then she slipped out of the car and vanished into the dark, tangled woods, a ghost moving silently toward the dragon's lair. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like a gunshot in the silent night. The imposing silhouette of the Willow Creek facility rose above the trees, a modern prison disguised as a place of healing. She was terrified, but one thought propelled her forward. "Dad, I'm coming." The crawl through the ventilation duct was claustrophobic and terrifying. The cold, damp metal scraped against her clothes, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the thin beam of her flashlight. Cobwebs brushed against her face, and the air was stale with the scent of decay and disinfectant. It felt like she was crawling into a tomb. After what seemed like an eternity, she saw a grate ahead. Using her multi-tool, she carefully undid the rusted bolts and lowered herself into the silent, cavernous basement of Willow Creek. The service tunnels were a labyrinth of pipes and conduits, dimly lit by caged emergency lights. A low hum. The sound of the building's life support vibrated through the concrete floor. "I'm in," she whispered into her mic. "Copy that?" Ben's voice crackled in her ear. "According to the plans, you need to find maintenance stairway C. It will take you to the first floor of the West Wing. Be quiet. They have orderlies on patrol." Navigating by the faded stencils on the walls, Maya found the stairway. She ascended cautiously, her every sense on high alert. The air grew warmer, the smell of disinfectant stronger. She emerged into a hallway that was nothing like the grimy basement. Here, everything was sterile and eerily quiet. The floors were polished marble. The walls were a soothing shade of cream, and soft, indirect lighting gave the corridor a serene, dreamlike quality. It was a beautiful, silent prison. The doors to the rooms were heavy oak with no names, only numbers. Each had a small reinforced glass window and a slot for food trays. "I'm in the West Wing," she breathed. "It's quiet. Too quiet. That's the high security ward. Ben said patients here are kept isolated. Walter said they're often heavily sedated. Start checking the rooms. You have 20 minutes left. Heart pounding. Maya began her grim task, moving from door to door, peering through the small windows. In the first room, an elderly woman sat staring at a blank television screen. In the next, a man was sleeping fitfully, muttering in his sleep. Each room held a person lost to the world their fortunes, paying for them to be kept out of sight and out of mind. Then she reached room 113. She peered through the glass and her world stopped. The room was sparse. A bed, a small table, a chair. Sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to the door, was a man with thinning gray hair. He was gaunt, his shoulders slumped in a posture of profound defeat. He was sketching in a small notebook with a pencil, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he turned his head slightly, and Maya saw his profile in the dim light. The face was older, thinner, etched with lines of sorrow she had never known. But it was him. The high forehead, the shape of his nose, the gentle curve of his brow. It was her father. A sob caught in her throat, and she clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle it. Tears streamed down her face. He was alive. After 10 years of believing he was dead, of mourning him, he was here. Ben, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I've found him. It's him. Okay, Maya. Okay. Ben's voice was a steady anchor in her emotional storm. Get the picture. You need proof. With trembling hands, she raised the phone. She had to get his face. She tapped lightly on the reinforced glass. Dad. The sound was barely audible, but in the profound silence of the hall, it was enough. Robert Jenkins flinched. He turned slowly, his eyes clouded and unfocused, as if he were looking at her from a great distance. There was a flicker of confusion, a ghost of recognition, but it was buried under a decade of medication and isolation. Dad, it's me, she whispered, pressing her hand against the cold glass. It's Maya. His brow furrowed. The name seemed to stir something deep within him. He took a hesitant step towards the door, his eyes trying to pierce through the fog of his consciousness. It was in that moment, as he looked towards her, his face filled with a heartbreaking mix of confusion and longing, that she got the picture. A clear shot of his face. The proof. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed from the end of the hallway, a metal door swinging shut. An orderly. Maya, you have to go now. Ben's voice was sharp in her ear. Patrol's coming. Panic seized her. She couldn't leave him. Not again. But she knew if she were caught, they would both be lost forever. The proof on her phone would be destroyed, and she would be silenced just like him. I love you, Dad, she whispered through the glass. I'm coming back for you. I promise. She didn't know if he understood, but as she turned to flee, she saw his hand rise and press against the glass, mirroring her own. Adrenaline surged through her. She sprinted back the way she came, her footsteps echoing in the silent corridor. She scrambled down the maintenance stairs, her lungs burning, and plunged back into the dark labyrinth of the basement. She found the ventilation duct, hoisted herself up, and crawled frantically back towards the outside world. The image of her father's face burned into her mind. When she finally tumbled out of the duct back into the wet, cold woods, she was gasping for air, covered in grime and tears. She ran, stumbling through the undergrowth, until she saw the welcome silhouette of Ben's rental car. She wrenched the door open and collapsed into the passenger seat, shaking uncontrollably. I have it, she gasped, holding up the phone like a holy relic. I have the proof. Ben didn't speak. He just put a steadying hand on her shoulder as she sobbed for the father she had lost, for the father she had found, and for the fight that was to come. They had breached the dragon's lair. Now they had to figure out how to slay the dragon. The photograph changed everything. It was grainy, taken through thick glass, but it was undeniable. The man in room 113 was Robert Jenkins. Ben Carter knew that this image, combined with Walter Schmidt's testimony and the forged document, was enough. He didn't just have a story. He had a bombshell that could shatter a corporate empire. He worked feverishly for the next 48 hours, locking himself in his apartment with Mir. He wrote the article of his life, a masterpiece of investigative journalism that laid out the entire sordid tale. He detailed the early partnership, the betrayal, the forged documents, the kidnapping disguised as a medical intervention, and the 10 years of illegal imprisonment. He embedded Mir's photograph, Walter's sworn affidavit, which he'd finally agreed to give on the record, and a side-by-side analysis of Robert's real signature against the forgery. He named Arthur Coleman not as a thief, but as a kidnapper. He didn't publish it on his fringe blog. This was too big. He called in the one favor he had left in the world with a former colleague, a senior editor at the Wall Street Journal, one of the few who had privately believed him 6 years ago. He sent the encrypted file with a simple message. Redemption, the story broke on a Tuesday morning. It didn't just make a splash, it was a global tsunami. Whereas Robert Jenkins became the #1 trending topic worldwide within an hour. The stock for Coleman Industries plummeted in pre-market trading, wiping out billions of dollars in value before the opening bell. News vans surrounded the company's gleaming headquarters and the gates of the Willow Creek Wellness Retreat. Arthur Coleman was blindsided. He issued a furious denial, calling it a vicious, baseless attack orchestrated by a disgraced journalist and a delusional young woman. But the photographic evidence was too compelling, the narrative too detailed. His carefully constructed wall of lies, which had stood for 20 years, crumbled into dust in a matter of hours. Federal agents, armed with a warrant issued on the strength of Ben's article, raided Willow Creek that afternoon. They found Robert Jenkins in his room just as Mir had described. He was disoriented and weak, but his mind, though clouded by years of improper medication, was still there. When a female agent gently asked his name, he looked at her and said with a clarity that shocked everyone, "My name is Robert Jenkins, and I want to see my daughter." The reunion happened not in a prison, but in a private, secure hospital. When Maya walked in, her father was sitting up in bed, free of his sedatives for the first time in a decade. He looked at her, and this time there was no fog in his eyes, only recognition and a profound, overwhelming love. "Maya," he whispered, his voice. "Horse, you found me." She rushed to his side, and they held each other, years of stolen time and silent grief melting away in an embrace. Helen was there too, holding her husband's hand. For the first time in 10 years, her own illness seeming to fade into the background in the face of this miracle. Arthur Coleman's downfall was as swift as it was total. He was arrested that evening, attempting to flee the country on his private jet. The legal battle was immense, but the evidence was insurmountable. Walter Schmidt's testimony, combined with the facility's illegally doctored medical records and the damning financial trail that led from Coleman's shell companies directly to Willow Creek, sealed his fate. He was convicted of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and a dozen counts of fraud. The empire built on his lie was dismantled. Coleman Industries was forced into bankruptcy and restructuring. But from its ashes, something new was born. The patents for Project Chimera, now rightfully returned to Robert Jenkins, became the foundation of a new company, Jenkins Carter Energy. Ben Carter, his reputation, not just restored, but legendary, took a place on the board, vowing to ensure the company always operated with the transparency he fought for. And at the helm as the new CEO was Maya Jenkins. She had traded her Waitress uniform for a business suit, but she had lost none of the fire that had driven her. She was no longer just the daughter of a genius. She was a leader in her own right. Her mind, once destined for theoretical physics, now dedicated to building a better future with the technology her father had created. Months later, Maya stood with her father and Ben in a clean, brightly lit laboratory, looking at a new schematic on a screen. Her father, though still recovering, had the old spark back in his eyes. "The containment field," Robert said, pointing at the screen. "I finally figured out the stabilization equation. It took me 10 years of thinking in that room, but I solved it." Maya smiled a real brilliant smile. "I know, Dad," she said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Let's go change the world for real this time." The story of Maya Jenkins is a powerful reminder that truth, no matter how deep it's buried, will always fight its way to the light. It's a story about the unbreakable bond between a father and a daughter, and the incredible courage it takes for one person to stand up to an empire of lies. Maya's journey from a heartbroken waitress, struggling to survive, to a powerful CEO who reclaimed her family's legacy, shows that our circumstances don't define us. Our choices do. She chose to fight, to believe, and to never give up on the ghost of the man who taught her to look at the stars. If this story of resilience, justice, and unwavering family love moved you, please help us share it with the world. Click the like button, Share this video with your friends and family. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will inspire and captivate you. Your support helps us continue to tell stories that matter.